Welcome to the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. I'm Salpi Ghazarian, and this is Steering the Conversation. Today's guest and conversation could not be more timely. Professor Armine Ishkanian of the London School of Economics recently published an article in the journal Current History, and the article is entitled Armenia's Unfinished Revolution. Now, if scholars knew this to be true even 5 months ago when Nikol Pashinyan led the popular revolt to unseat the entrenched Republican Party and its leader Serzh Sargsyan, today, this week, the general public also sees the obvious truth in this. The Prime Minister and his government have taken back to the streets to consolidate the revolution in the face of continuing stalling by a parliament that is still largely in Republican Party hands. Armine Ishkanian, welcome.
Thank you, Salpi, for the invitation. Happy to be with you.
Do you agree with the assessment that he's trying to consolidate?
Yes, I do. I think, it's very important at this point that he needs to consolidate and be able to pass the laws, the reforms, and the policies in order to move the country forward from the stagnation that it had been facing before. So I think it's really important that the changes in parliament, that there are new parliamentary elections, that parliamentary elections should be called, and he should be able to have the opportunity to pass the laws and to do the things he needs to do.
Is it fair that we're calling this a revolution? Is that the accurate term? Is that the politically accurate construct?
That's a very good question. Some have called this simply regime change, but I think it is revolutionary in the sense that he's trying to promote new types of values and a new type of culture in Armenia and among Armenians more generally. So in that sense, it is revolutionary. It is trying to move forward particular ideas, particular new kinds of thinking, a new kind of democratic culture, I would even say. He seems to be practicing what scholars would call direct democracy, very much about taking the things directly to the people. And he's had to do that out of necessity in part, but also I think it's a style of governing. It's the way that he's always operated. So in that sense, what we're seeing is a kind of democracy, but it is very dangerous at this point because, as I said in the article, but also, as we've witnessed this past couple of days, much remains to be done. It's an unfinished revolution. I would also go. Go ahead.
Well, in your article, you cite 3 reasons for why this happened and why it succeeded. One is that this is a charismatic leader. The other is that the timing was right for many reasons. What the Republican Party was doing, people's angst, Serzh Sargsyan's constitutional maneuvers. But the third reason that you cite, the one that for me is the most interesting, is that this was in some ways the result of the accumulation of successful civil society actions. Can we talk about that? Because I think that politically, people have looked at these various aspects, but the public seems to focus on the one-man formula.
No, that's true. I have argued that there was that constituency. There were activists who were already involved in trying to push for reforms and for political change, not just for 1 year, but for many years. And as I wrote in the article, some of them are now and were in his party and were supporting him at a more political level, even before the revolution. And I think it's very important that Armenia doesn't experience what happened in Georgia, assuming everything goes, things don't revert back to the RP.
What does that mean?
Yeah, revert back. What we need to see is that if he is able to consolidate his power, that it doesn't come at the cost of, for instance, weakening civil society, because if all of civil society goes into his government, who's going to stand outside? And I think there is that element, what we're calling the civil society post-revolutionary paradox, that after revolution, civil society becomes weaker because they either join the government or B, they're more reluctant to criticize. And I don't think that's necessarily happening, because if we look at what's happening with Amusar, they're still very outspoken activists. But I think right now all of that is moot because he hasn't consolidated his power. And I think what he said he was planning to do in terms of his resignation and all of these multiple steps. There's so much risk involved.
Let
And
me
I think
push back. But let me push back in because the second thing you said there, the absence of civil society, therefore, to a great extent, the absence of critical, uh, even well-meaning, critical analysis. That is something that is happening in Armenia. And other than some social media spaces, there's not a lot of credence given to why that's important. The binary seems to continue. You criticize if you don't like the government. If you like the government, therefore you don't criticize.
that has been the case. And I think part of that is because they want to give him time, but also there's a there's fear among activists that the other side, the Republican Party, their supporters, and so forth, can use this in a way, and that the situation hasn't been consolidated, that things are not yet set in, it's not a done deal. The revolution isn't finished. He hasn't, completed what needs to be done. And so I think whether some people are calling it, the Velvet Revolution 2.0, I don't think it's 2.0. I think it's the same Velvet Revolution going through different phases, and it needs to get beyond, the one man and really and this is why I think we can't focus on the one man. There needs to be stronger participation. There needs to be, and not just calling people to the streets every so often, but I think from a political perspective, new political parties need to also emerge, not necessarily recycling the old ones that we know, but I think new political parties, and they need to be focused not on big man politics of one man, but very much around ideas, around platforms, around policies. And I think that's what needs to happen for more democratic development in Armenia. But obviously, all of that is going to take time.
So tell me if you agree with this. Is there this irony that on the one hand, it was the strength that civil society had accumulated by achieving small victories along the way? This was a civil society that was able to contribute to this revolution, regime change, ready to participate. And now, in some ways, that civil society has ceded its agency, its role in continuing to consolidate this change.
I think that's in part true, but I think his victory wasn't only because he had the active part of civil society behind him. I think there was also the element that he was able to reach out to the wider society by speaking the language of the masses, by presenting himself. And in fact, most likely he is a man of the people in the sense. Because among some civil society activists, there is a bit of elitism. And I think, that leads to an inability to reach out and to connect with those who are not necessarily as educated or of a particular class as they are. And I think what Nikol was able to do was that he was able to, link with those, the active civil society segments of of Armenia, but also reach out. Now, after the revolution, yes, among the active segment of civil society in terms of the critique. It's not the way that they were criticizing the RPA or Serzh Sargsyan's regime and so forth. So there is that element. But I think there needs to be a stronger civil society. In any case, for the development of Armenia, for sustainable democratic development, you need that counterbalance to the government. It can't simply be on the shoulders of the government, of the state, in my opinion.
In your article, you've also referred to the carnival-like atmosphere during that month and a half when Pashinyan was walking, gathering resources. And the same thing can be said, really, for these last couple of days on the street. It's interesting that you use that terminology because the anthropologists who had studied the 1988 period also used that terminology, that it was festival-like, right? How does that help to consolidate people power?
Yes, Levon Abrahamian had used that terminology, and I think as had Stella Grigorian. I think I also mentioned the element of emotions in the context of movement and revolutions. And I think very much part of that argument is that in order to succeed, to bring people around a position, to mobilize collective action, you need to tap into emotions. And the carnival like atmosphere is the positive emotions of joy, of solidarity, of love. Whereas he was also banking on the negative emotions that people felt against, for instance, the former prime minister, former president Serzh Sargsyan, the RPA, the Republican Party of Armenia. So the anger, the indignation. So I think that is an element that we need to take into account because it's, again, sometimes emotions can get out of control. It's been very difficult, I think, particularly looking at what was happening yesterday, to control the anger, to control the emotion. I'm not talking about Pashinyan's emotions necessarily, but of the crowd, because when people were massed, they were indignant. The language being used was, we feel betrayed, that this was a kind of treacherous act. And so I think this is a very volatile, very tumultuous moment. So governing it and steering it into a particularly positive direction will be difficult. It will take all of the resources that he has.
So one last question. The the uh, the situation here, the standoff, is, according to some, a standoff between those in parliament who are making the rules and, in their mind, abiding by those rules. And on the other side, a popular, powerful political leader who does every now and then imply that if we don't like these rules, and if they don't play by the rules in the way in which we want them to, we will not play by those rules and we will stick to the street. Now, is that legitimate politics?
We are in an era, because I'm living in Britain and experiencing Brexit, where we're making up the rules as we go along in a lot of ways. We're not in, we're in uncharted territory in many ways.
We're not in Kansas
Here
anymore.
in this country, in Britain, but also, in Armenia. And who makes laws? People make laws. How did this constitution come to be the way that it is? It was done through a particular process in 2015, imitating the Russian example, and it was done so as to consolidate the power of particular rulers. So I don't think we need to, fetishize or reify the laws, talking about them as if, they are the be all and end all. That said, it's very important to respect rule of law. But if there are unjust laws, there needs to be mechanisms that can be used in order to change those laws. Because slavery, for instance, in the United States used to be legal. We're not saying that that was right. So everything that is legal or by the book or by the law doesn't mean that it's morally or ethically correct. So I think we need to have a perspective on that. And I think the concern here is that they don't want elections to be called because they fear, rightly so, that they lack the popularity that they'll be reelected. Here I'm talking about the ARF, Prosperous Armenia, and the RPA, and they are being obstructionist. But the danger is that as long as the situation, the stagnation goes on, governing the country is becoming incredibly difficult because he can't enact the social and economic policies he wants to enact. He can't reform the judiciary. He can't, enact this process of transitional justice that he's been talking about. So all of this seems to be on hold. It's what Gramsci would say. We're in an interregnum where the old is dying, but the new has yet to be born. And so it's a very precarious situation. I don't like to predict what's going to happen. Scholars generally refrain from those kinds of predictions, but I think it is going to take very, very careful political maneuvering and also recognizing how much he can use the power of the people, because there is a limit. He does need to also build certain coalitions and alliances with particular political forces in order to have that support. It's not enough just to bring people to the streets every single time.
Thank you, Professor Armine Ishkanian. This will not be the last time we talk about this topic, I'm sure. We've been speaking with Professor Armine Ishkanian of the London School of Economics about the political changes in Armenia, regime change, revolution, and the standoff between the new government and the parliament that is still largely run by the old Republican Party, which has most recently changed parliamentary session rules to extend them in ways that if the street were ever to block a session, that session will be considered a continuing session and therefore not allow for the opportunities that the people and the Pashinyan government are looking for in order to be able to go to special elections. Was that fair?
Fair.
Thank you again. Thank you, Armine, and we'll talk to you again. This is Salpi Ghazarian, and this is Steering the Conversation.